You are watching Poirot Tales. I'm your host, David. This is where every mystery leads to a new discovery. Kindly like our videos and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me which part of the world you are watching from. Welcome to Poirot Tales. Let's start the story. Snow had begun to drift again just before dusk, falling in slow fat flakes that turned the hedges to billows and softened the ruined gateposts along the lane to Alderwick Grange. Inside the old manor, a string quartet coaxed winter-bright music from gut and horsehair, while villagers shrugged off greatcoats and brushed powder from hats, cheeks and shoulders. Sprigs of rosemary steamed in copper bowls set near the hearths, and ribbons of white paper lanterns gave the long gallery a pale glow like frost lit from within. Hercule stood near a mullioned window, gloved hands folded on his walking stick, watching how the room breathed, which clusters of talk opened and closed, which smiles were fixed and which were allowed to rest. He had arrived that afternoon from the north by motor coach that complained at every hill, a small valise and a metal travelling case his only luggage. The invitation had reached him by a curious route, forwarded twice and at the last moment from a private club in York. It had mentioned a charity winter fete for the village infirmary fund, and in a thin postscript, the recent letting of Alderwick Grange to a fashionable couple from London. The postscript, not the fete, had made him change his plans. He watched the couple now as they did the work of new arrivals, accepting praise for improvements that were not theirs, making light of draughts that did not trouble their city bones. Lysander Vale was narrow as a fencing foil, quick with a laugh that showed handsome teeth, and vanished again before it reached his eyes. His wife, Seraphine, dark-haired and pale, wore a blue silk that managed to look warm as velvet and cold as moonlight at once. She moved with the self-protective economy of someone given to headaches or secrets. When she smiled, the muscles along her jaw did not. "You observe, Monsieur Hercule," said a voice at his elbow. "Observe and hold judgment, yes?" The speaker was the parish vestryman Crispin Oates, all tweed and careful charity. "We rely on the city's generosity this year. Lord knows the infirmary roof cannot see another thaw." Hercule inclined his head. "Generosity travels quickest when the road is well prepared. The vicar's wife has done her work." "Mrs. Cray?" "Tireless." Oates glanced toward the doorway where a small tempest of practical goodwill directed volunteers with covered platters. "She is why we will endure this winter with roofs and stockings intact. You are a friend of the Vales?" "A friend of invitation," said Hercule. "We are all friends of something tonight." He turned his attention to the room's other orbits. Major Gideon Stone stood oak-solid near the fire, telling a story about a fog-bound convoy, his hands describing distances with a sailor's economy. The schoolmistress, Althea Rowan, sipped from a thin glass and watched the door with the attention of one accustomed to counting heads. The apothecary, Felix Dorr, moved through the crowd with the serene pace of a man who knows that in the end, every ailment passes through his hands, whether with tonic or prayer. And there was Violet Marden, widow of the former owner of Alderwick Grange and now its landlady, her thin mouth pressed in a line of gallant resignation. She had let the house because repairs had outpaced what a careful widow can measure out from investments and economies. All this the village knew. The village is an open pantry for such knowledge. The quartet finished a carol and the vicar, Matthias Cray, thin and anxious as a stork, called for attention with a tapping spoon. Speeches, gratitude, the discreet auction of a watercolour of the harbour in summer. Seraphine Vale stood a step behind her husband as he spoke, and did not once look toward the apothecary's table, where a row of small silvered bottles had been set out as donations to the raffle. Hercule observed that without needing to wonder why he had. When the applause had settled and the chatter thickened again, Seraphine drifted toward the staircase that ran up from the end of the gallery, her hand brushing the carved rail, her expression composed. Lysander was detained by Major Stone, and a joke about London restaurants and honest gravy. "Mrs. Vale is unwell," Mrs. Cray said, materializing with a keen glance. She asked for the quiet room upstairs. "Would you—" "Oh, but you are a guest." Her eyes slid past him, seeking someone composed but useful. "Mira, dear. Mira." Kovacs, the violinist hired from the town, set down her instrument and came at once. Hers was a quiet beauty with the habit of listening so wholly that most who spoke to her confided more than they meant. "Of course," she said. "I have respite hands." She took a small bottle from her case and slipped it into a pocket. "For temples," she explained. "Oil of rue and lavender." Hercule followed their progress with his eye until the turn of the stair hid them, then took a step nearer the apothecary's table. The silvered bottles were neatly labelled in compact. Hand peppermint spirits, cordial of gentian, sal volatile for the faint. The corks were wax-dipped, and the wax was freshly scored to make opening easy. Beside the bottles lay a small brass mortar polished until it reflected the ceiling beams in fisheye. Felix Dor saw the direction of Hercule's gaze and smiled his shopkeeper's smile. "You approve my table." "I approve of order," Hercule said, "and of wax that tells the truth when it is broken. The raffle winners will be grateful for both." Dor's manner was cheerful. His eyes were tired. "And you, sir, do you require a restorative?" "I require very little," said Hercule, "but I am interested." He let the word rest where Dor would hear both meanings. Lysander Vale disengaged at last from the major and came to stand beside the apothecary with the easy entitlement of a man who did not learn in childhood to ask permission in a shop. He picked up a bottle, held it to the light, smiled at his own reflection and set it down again too hard. The bottles chimed against each other. "Careful," said Dor with more warmth than rebuke. "Forgive me," said Lysander. "I have high spirits when money moves in the right direction." "The roof shall be as snug as a banker's conscience," he laughed. No one did more than smile. Hercule withdrew a little then and took a turn about the gallery. Near the hearth, Violet Marden stopped wringing her hands long enough to touch the carved acorn on the mantelpiece, as if it were a bell pull for good luck. Althea Rowan jotted something in a small notebook that she averted when anyone drew near. Major Stone accepted a glass from the innkeeper. Bram Yarrow sniffed it, nodded, and drank. Mrs. Cray scolded a volunteer for bringing in snow on boots, and then apologized and then scolded again for not minding the scolding. The village moved as villages move when watched, like a flock that cannot admit it is a flock. The silence, when it came, moved down the staircase like a cold draught. A sound, sharper than a dropped glass, softer than a cry, reached the gallery first and rearranged the faces there. Mrs. Cray's hand went to her mouth. Dor's fingers settled on his brass mortar, as if to steady the room. Lysander half turned toward the stairs, stilled as if someone had placed a palm on the center of his chest. Then Mira Kovacs appeared at the landing, breath clouding, eyes wide. "Mrs. Vale," she said, not loudly, and therefore heard by everyone. "Please, there are people who run toward trouble in order to be the one who tells the story afterward. There are people who run toward it because they are needed." Bram Yarrow and Major Stone were first up the stairs, one practical, one grim. Hercule followed on a line between them, neither pushing nor delaying, and behind them came the doctor, Sabine Hart, who had been standing with the vicar's wife and now moved with her bag like a small, purposeful vessel under sail. The quiet room had been made as pleasant as such things can be, a chaise near a brazier, a framed sampler declaring that house is a harbour, a faint smell of beeswax and lavender. Seraphine Vale lay against the bolster, with her head turned toward the window. The colour had left her mouth and gathered in fragile patches along her cheekbones. On the small table by her hand stood a water-glass with a trace of something candied along the rim, and beside it a crumpled paper twist, the sort confectioners use for sugared peel. Mira had done what could be done, and then stopped doing what could harm, loosened stays, set a shawl, cleared space. She stood now with both hands flat against her own arms, as if to forbid herself from wringing them. Dr. Hart knelt, pressed fingers to the jaw, lifted an eyelid, listened at the sternum. "Breathing shallow," she said in a voice that had the steadiness of habit. "Pulse thin. Not apoplexy, not simple faint." She lifted the paper twist between two fingers. "What was in this?" "Candied orange," said Mira. From the table in the small parlor. Who brought it? I did, said a voice from the doorway. Lysander. His charm had been scraped down to something like bone. She asked for something clean-tasting. The wine disagreed with her. I fetched Peel because it is cheerful. Did she eat? Said Hart without looking at him. I think one piece. Perhaps two. Hercule moved nearer the small table and bent slightly, not enough to cast shadow on the glass. The candied sugar along the rim had been disturbed in a narrow arc where a careful mouth had sipped. The rest still shone evenly. On the floor beneath the table lay a drop of something viscous, not water. Water spreads obediently on wood, and not wine. He turned his head and found the brazen brazier casting a steady heat. Air rose with it and carried scents to him. Lavender, beeswax, candied citrus, and something else sharp, like the rind of almond or the pit of a bitter fruit, quickly gone, as if ashamed to be noticed. Get her downstairs, Hart said to Bram Yarrow and Major Stone, in a tone that permitted no misunderstanding. Near the hearth, where the air is warm and the light is good. She glanced at Mira. Tell Mrs. Cray to send for Felix Dorr. If we have salts and soda in quantity, and a stomach pump if the worst comes, we may not need either. She put the paper twist in her bag without fuss. You will not move her, said Lysander. He had not raised his voice. He had simply laid a plank of refusal in the doorway. My wife will not be carried through a gallery like a spectacle. Bram Yarrow did not look at him. Right arm, Major, I have the legs. On the count. They lifted with the careful insolence of men who serve the situation, not the man. Seraphine made no sound, save a thin breath that might have been the wind. In the long gallery the quartet had fallen into a murmur of tuning sounds, and then, in uncertainty, into silence. Mrs. Cray went white around the mouth when she saw the party descend. Oh, my dear, she said, which may have been to Seraphine or to Dr. Hart or to God. Violet Marden stepped forward, then stepped back as if she had been struck by something the rest had not seen. Crispin Oates began asking sensible questions in the wrong order. Felix Dorr arrived at speed, his shop apron hastily untied, his hair dusted with flour or snow. He took one look at Seraphine and at the items on the tray, then met Hart's eyes. I have what you will need, he said. Oh, I should not guess. Hercule watched how the room received this new arrangement. Who tried to be useful, who tried to be near, who tried to vanish. Major Stone supervised with his voice. Mira brought towels and water without needing to be told. Althea Rowan stood half a pace too far away and looked as if she were learning a lesson she had waited for. Violet Marden pressed a folded cloth to her mouth again and again, and then stopped as if she had remembered something she had sworn not to remember. Lysander Vale poured a glass of water and did not offer it to anyone. Dr. Hart and Felix Dorr worked with grave efficiency. The pump did not come out of the bag, which meant the worst possibility had passed by. Smelling salts pricked the air into brightness. Seraphine's chest rose and fell now with more authority. Her eyelids moved with a flutter that suggested someone climbing a steep path to where other people were waiting. Not arsenic, Dorr said quietly, when there was a moment for quiet. Not strychnine. The breath would have told us. Something bitter but clean. Too clean. Cyanosis is not see the nails, no. Digitalis, said Hart. Perhaps. Dorr looked toward the paper twist now folded on the tray. Or a varnish where sugar ought to be. Who made the peel? Hart asked the room. Mrs. Yarrow, said Mrs. Cray promptly, half offended that anyone would ask, half relieved to be able to answer. Bram's wife has made it every year since we will not disgrace her kitchen with suspicion, said Dorr in the same practical voice. Someone might have handled it after it was made. A hand that belonged elsewhere. The hand was an idea that moved through the crowd, as if it had been waiting at the window to be let in. People shifted to make room for it. Hercule followed the idea to its first place, the small parlor. He excused himself without apology and crossed the hall. The parlor was a low-ceilinged room with a table set for sweets. Platters of biscuits and peel stood under domes of glass. On each the sugar had taken the light and stiffened it into loveliness. The dome nearest the door was fogged by the room's warmth, then cleared, then fogged again as if it breathed. Hercule lifted it, noted the weight and the way the glass's edge had left a faint wet circle on the wood. He set it back. The circle was not quite whole. A wedge of absence at the rim told the truth that a cloth tells when it is moved. The dome had been lifted and replaced not quite in the same turn. He crouched and looked under the table. People seldom look under tables unless they are young or hunting a cat. There, exactly where one would rest a hand, while crouching to set a thing just so, a tiny bright fleck had fallen to the floorboards and adhered. He took a clean handkerchief from his pocket, borrowed a knife from the sideboard, and lifted the fleck as gently as if it were a snowflake he wanted to show to a child. The handkerchief smelled faintly of starch and fern. The fleck smelled of orange, and of something else that belonged in a workshop, not a kitchen. When he stood, the door showed him a reflection. His own small figure doubled, and then made more by the polished wood. In that reflection, another figure hung for an instant behind him, surprised at being caught at the door. Althea Rowan, schoolmistress, notebook tucked under her arm, stood in the threshold with a face arranged to look as if she had simply been passing. She did not step in. She did not step away. "You are curious, mademoiselle," said Hercule without turning. "Curiosity is good for the mind. It keeps it moving, and so it does not freeze." "You are looking where one would not think to look," she said, as if giving him a grade. "Thunder tables. People hide what they do not wish to see again where they will not have to bend to see it. I think a house tells you things when you ask with respect." He folded the handkerchief, placed it in his pocket, and set the knife where it belonged. "Your pupils do not like to look at their shoes when they are scolded. That is because they know the shoes will tell on them, the mud, the scuff. It is instructive to look where a child looks." She swallowed, considered, and nodded as if she would write it down later as a principle. "Will she die?" She asked then in a voice that belonged to a village and not to a schoolroom. "I do not know," he said, because it was true. From the gallery came a rustle that was almost relief. Seraphine had found her way to a chair and was breathing as if the next breath were not a question but a fact. Dr. Hart gave orders that sounded like permission to be useful. Warm blankets. "Weak tea, Mrs. Cray. To send someone for Lysander's overcoat because husbands must fetch something." Inspector Rowan Calder arrived 40 minutes later, snow on his shoulders and apology on his face. It was the sort of apology men in uniform learn to give when they are late to something that has been reported by 3 people in 3 different voices. He had grey in his hair and patience around his eyes. He stood at the door and took the temperature of the room before he took any statements. "Sabine," he said to Dr. Hart. "Will she live?" "Likely," Hart said with a gratitude that neither announced nor hid the friendship between them. "We caught whatever it was early enough. She will tell us more when she can." "Then we will not wake magistrates tonight," said Calder. "But we will not sleep either." He took names in a small leather book whose corners had been rounded by years of pockets. He asked questions in a voice that made the questions sound like the sort of things people say to each other over washing up. When he reached Hercule, he added a half-smile as if they had both been introduced long ago to the same truth. "Sir?" "Hercule," said the small man. "If you have use of a pair of eyes that do not enjoy their own reflection, I am at your service." Calder's smile deepened just enough. "I don't object to help when the person offering it has already helped," he said. "You have that look." "Which look?" "The look of a man who has found something and put it in his pocket." He glanced, without moving his head toward the parlor. "Then we are already friends," said Hercule. Crispinotes delivered blankets. Mrs. Cray delivered a prayer disguised as instructions. Violet Martin, having remembered what she had sworn not to remember, came and stood near Hercule and did not speak, which told him she had decided that speaking would be more dangerous than silence. Lysander Vale fetched the overcoat and then forgot why he had brought it. When at last the guests were shepherded out in careful handfuls, Bram Yarrow went to fetch his wife. The apothecary returned to his shop to prepare draughts. Dr. Hart set a guard at the door. Mira Kovacs, whose respite hands could become hands of refusal if need be. Althea Rowan wrote something down in her book and kept the book close. Major Stone went out to look at the snow, as if it were something that might be attacked. The vicar folded the hymn schedule for Sunday into a smaller and smaller rectangle until it could not hold any more order at all. On his way out, Hercule paused at the threshold to the small parlor. He bent again and checked the circle left by the glass dome. The wedge of absence was smaller now. Someone had adjusted the dome to look more right. The house had been corrected by a person who did not like to leave anything not quite so. That was a temperament, and tempers, like fingerprints, are not easily disguised. Outside, the wind had dropped. Snow hung in the trees like a decision not yet announced. Hercule drew his coat tighter and let his breath make its little cloud. A hand had carried something sweet through a room and changed it. A different hand had lifted a glass and dampened a rim. Someone who liked adjustment had adjusted. Someone who waited for a chance had taken it. The village would begin in the morning to add words to the spaces between actions, and those words would be useful if you knew how to hear what they were trying to hide. He walked to the inn with the inspector and Dr. Hart, their boots crisping loud on the hardening snow. "Shall I list my questions?" Calder asked after a time. "If it will rest your mind to let them out to walk," said Hercule. "Who had reason to harm Mrs. Vale? Did they plan for her or anyone? Did the peel carry a poison or the glass carry a varnish? Why did Violet Marden look as if she had seen a ghost that belonged to this house and not to any other?" "Add one thing," said Hercule. "Who is the person who cannot abide wedges in circles?" Calder nodded, though he had not been in the parlor. "Yes," he said, "that one too." They parted at the inn's door. Hercule climbed the narrow stairs to his room, set his metal traveling case on the table and opened it. He placed the folded handkerchief beside a clean saucer and opened it with the care he had learned for such tasks. The fleck lay in the square's center, like a syllable in a script no one else had thought to learn. He lifted it with a pin and touched it to the saucer. It left a faint smear the color of candlelight. He put the handkerchief to his nose again. "Orange, yes, something sharper. Not almond, not bitter pit. Not print shop ink. Something that has to do with finishing, not flavor." He cut a page from his notebook with a penknife and wrote down, "Varnish." "Painter," fastidious hand. Then he folded the square again and blew out the lamp. The dark came down like a cloak, the cold with it, and from somewhere beyond the lane a dog sent up a single comfortless bark and stopped. In the morning the village would wake with a story most had already decided how to tell. Hercule turned on his side and let his mind return to circles and wedges, to glass and sugar, to the way a young woman lay with her head toward a window, as if she did not want to miss what was going to happen next. Morning came brittle and painfully bright. The snow's crust glazed to a sheen that made every hedge look sugar-glazed and treacherous. The village woke to news in fragments. Alderwick. The fate. Mrs. Vale. The doctor came quick. Alive, thank God. Poison? By 9, Inspector Rowan Calder had posted a "Constable at the Grange's front" step, and sent another to the apothecary for supplies. No one wished to say aloud in the lane. Hercule ate bread and a slice of Bram Yarrow's cold ham in the inn's small breakfast room, watching the condensation form and vanish on the window pane like breaths in a conversation. He unfolded his notebook and wrote without looking. Dome, wedge corrected. Hand that adjusts. Varnish? Who handles sugars? Mira, oils. Then he set his pen down because Mrs. Yarrow herself arrived with more tea and a storm in her apron. "You'll have been told they lay it at my peel," she said without greeting, copper hair escaping its pins like thoughts escaping decorum. "I'll not have my kitchen made a byword. I scrub and I boil and I bottle. You can lick my scullery door and catch nothing but green soap." "Madame," Hercule said mildly, "I would not think to lick any door not previously introduced to me. Please, sit. Describe your peel." She folded almost against her will. "Oranges from the co-op, 2 stone and 6. I cut the peel thin, blanched thrice, syrup of sugar and water. Slow as Sunday, nip of brandy at the finish for the gleam. Dried it on racks 2 days and kept it under domes. I watched those domes like they were christenings. You placed them last night?" "An hour before anyone came. I only lifted a dome to refill once, when Bram told me the first platter was down by half. After that I had my hands full of soup and husbands who can't find spoons. Who else had business at your table?" She sniffed. "Everyone and their white gloves. Who touched the domes?" Her eyes narrowed. The schoolmistress set one back crooked and then straightened it again. She's one for a square corner, that one. The vestryman brushed at the rim as if it might stain his conscience, and the London gentleman tapped a dome with his ring like it was a bell. That's all I saw because I have only 2 eyes, and they are not at the back of my head, however folks suppose a cook can see like God. Did anyone come through your kitchen to the small parlour? Mrs. Yarrow's chin came up. Mr. Vale brought a twist of peel to his wife in the quiet room. He took it from my parlour with a nod like a duke taking a curtsy. The violin lady came for a rag to wrap her bottle. Oils, she said, for temples. Smelled like a garden I could not afford. Inspector Calder passed through to wash his hands, bless him. The man's clean. And Miss Rowan Althea. She came twice on pretext for plates, and wrote something each time in that little book of hers, as if she were counting my spoons. You will testify to this, if asked. If it keeps them from mouthing my peal for murder, I'll stand on the church steps and sing it. Hercule thanked her with seriousness that calmed the flurry in her apron. When she had gone, he added to his page, Mira, oils of rue and lavender. Violin, polish? Althea straightens. Lysander ring taps. Inspector Calder arrived at the inn a little later, coat steaming, jaw blue rough. He took coffee black and a heel of bread, and set his notebook between them as if it were an extra place laid for trouble. Mrs. Vale lives, he reported. Sabine says she will curse us by midday for the tea and the broth and the fuss. That suggests the poison was not heavy, and not built to finish a job in one draught. Daw tasted a pinhead of residue against his tongue, frowned and wouldn't name it. He'll have more by noon. The piece of peel I lifted in the parlour had varnish in its company, Hercule said. A flake? Orange with a brightness that belongs to wood, not fruit. Calder looked almost pleased. Then we say varnish. Now we must find whose life smells of it. You notice the violinist, Hercule said. I notice that Mirakovac carries a case that smells like an old chapel. My father mended pews. Calder knocked his knuckles lightly on the tabletop. Resin, shellac, orange oil. You can taste it from 50 paces. Orange oil gives the gleam, Hercule mused, as Mrs. Yarrow's brandy does for the peel. The scent binds what should not be bound, unless one's nose is clever or one's habits are wrong. Calder tucked that away with a small nod. Walk with me to the Grange. Sabine wants to speak and Daw wants to frown at us closer. They crossed the hard yard and the glittering lane. Alderwick stood against the white morning with its windows black as inkwells. The constable at the door tried to be invisible and failed. Inside, the long gallery had been stripped of its lanterns. Meltwater made small transparencies along the floor where boots had been careless. The quiet room was warmer than the night before. A kettle ticked. Blankets steamed gently on the back of a chair. Seraphine Vale lay against pillows in a state that is not sleep and not vigilance. Her eyelids moved. Her lips were dry. Dr. Sabine Hart took Hercule's hand in both of hers and squeezed once like a pulse. You look as if you slept 3 hours, she said. A luxury. She will be with us. She will be miserable about it. For now, no talk. But I did wish to say... She lifted the paper twist from her bag in a glass jar. What remains of the sugar is stained at the corner. Not with brandy. Felix? Calder asked. Daw stood with his sleeves rolled back, a white crescent under each fingernail like new moons. Spirit varnish, he said at last, with the air of a man who prefers to be sure before he is useful. Shellac in alcohol and something added for the nose, orange oil or lemon. I could nearly set it alight with a breath. The quantity is small. A smear would do to make a mouth bitter and a tongue numb, to lower the stomach's welcome and play at the heart. If a person were frail already, was she? Hercule asked softly. Hart's look weighed a doctor's ethics against a village's safety. Migraine, a heart that flutters sometimes when it ought to beat. Tinctures that help if used with care and harm if used with impatience. I did not prescribe this harm. Who in this house keeps varnish in reach? Calder asked the heir. Who in this village? And who would put it where sugar lives? It is not the apothecary, Daw said levelly before suspicion could thread from Calder's question to his apron. I varnish nothing but a splint, and then with oil that reeks of linseed. This is not mine. Violins, Hercule said. Furniture, gilding, frames, Frames, repeated Violet Marden from the doorway as if she had heard her name. The widow held her hands together as if to keep them from flying. Mr. Vale had the ballroom frames polished yesterday afternoon, 3 of them. He said London eyes cannot endure dust. I told him dust is the house's memory, and he said memory is for books. So she stopped, and a small colourless thing that might have been anger or grief flickered and hid. Who did the polishing? Said Calder. Violet swallowed. The signwriter from Cretan, Gable & Son. Only the son came. He's called Noel Gable, and he does finishing, not only letters. He brought a little tin and a bundle of rags, and he whistled very soft and very sure of himself. Is he still about? Calder asked. He went when the lanterns were lit, Violet said. Said he had mist on the roads to race before it went to glass. He is proud of his boots. He walked on the stone and not the carpet, because he prides himself on leaving no mark. Hercule felt the shape of the flake in his pocket, like the memory of a coin. Boots, yes, he said, and hands that are neat with edges. They took Violet's word and her directions, and sent a message to Cretan by the constable. Meanwhile, Calder set the household to a slow wheel of questions. He had a way of making a list sound like a mercy. Lysander Vale took his place for questioning, with the stiff grace of a man who has rehearsed being reasonable and knows it will not hold. If you mean to ask whether my wife has enemies, Inspector, be modern and say instead, who has grievances? Enemies belong in books. Grievances live in cottages. Calder's pencil rested. List grievances, then. We let this house, Lysander said with a small cold smile, meaning your village's beloved Alderwick. Mrs. Marden had to be persuaded by arithmetic. She did not enjoy it. Major Stone finds my wine thin and my manners thinner. The apothecary thinks I ought to take his draughts for my nerves, which are not yours to diagnose, Mr. Daw. And the schoolmistress writes letters to my wife when she should be writing to the vicar about slates. The violinist stares at me, as if I were a puzzle with one piece missing. Will these suffice? You fetched the peel, Calder said. I did. I thought to be kind. Will you put kindness in your book as evidence? My wife will tell you I do not handle sweets, Inspector. I handle bills and invitations, and the admiration of those who cannot get tickets on their own. Hercule watched the flicker at the corner of Lysander's mouth that betrayed appetites not named. Your ring, he said as if in passing. It makes a small bell of glass when you tap. You did this last night to a dome, did I? Lysander examined his signet as if it belonged to another man. If I did, I didn't mean to make a music of it. I tape everything. You are impatient, Hercule said. Impatience leaves rings in softer things than glass. Lysander snorted faintly. I am not on trial in a French farce, sir. Not yet, said Calder without malice. We will call you if we require more. Althea Rowan came next with her notebook closed under her palm like a book of prayers. She sat upright and arranged her skirt so the hem made a straight line with the edge of the chair. You lifted a dome and corrected it, Calder said. I could not leave it crooked, she replied, with a faint incredulity that anyone could. Children go wrong because no one straightens a thing when it first shows a tendency to tilt. Hercule watched a small vein in her temple tally his reproof before it was delivered. You passed into the parlour twice after Mrs. Vale went upstairs. I fetched plates, she said. Mrs. Cray asked. I wrote nothing of consequence. Lists of which children were to bring what to the school tableau, and then I realized I had left them at home, so I wrote them again. It is a schoolmistress's fate to write lists twice. You saw Mira Kovacs fetch a rag, Hercule said as if remarking on weather. I smelled her bottle, Althea answered, surprising him. Rue and lavender. I do not care for rue. It is a disciplinarian's herb, bitter and correct. You saw Noel Gable at the frames. I saw him polish what did not need polishing, which is a sin, Calder murmured. It is a provocation, Althea said, and for the first time the iron under her tact rang audible. Village houses are made to remember. Men from towns walk in and try to erase. Did you see Mrs. Marden near the parlour after the incident? Hercule asked. Althea's pause was a third of a heartbeat too long. She stood in the doorway and did not step through. It was as if a mark had been drawn and she would not cross it. Mira came when called with her case slung on a strap, and her hair tied roughly as if she had dressed in a hurry and then not had the heart to perfect it. She took the chair without fidgeting. Her hands were still, the way musicians' hands learn to be still to prove they can also be quick. "Your temple oil," Calder said. She set out the small brown bottle. "Oleum rutae and lavandulae, Kovacs. 14 rose court, the label a neat hand. The wax seal unbroken last night and now not. I used 3 drops," she said. "On my fingers, on her temples. I would not poison anyone with something intended for mercy." "You can smell it and know that you are not in a chemist's shop." Calder unstoppered and held it to his nose. Rue's bitterness rose like a reprimand and was gone. Lavender lay behind it, a clean field that made the room feel less crowded. He nodded. "Your violin," Hercule said softly. "It has its own oils." Mira's mouth quirked. "Yes, I polish with orange oil when strings are changed. I varnish nothing. The varnish belongs to the instrument and to the maker. A player respects what she is given. Anyone who tells you he improves an old varnish is either a liar or a fool." "Yet orange oil," Hercule began. "Is everywhere," she returned with an apologetic shrug. "On furniture, on ragbag cloths. On my case because I leaned it last week against a chair someone had refreshed with too much zeal. If you smelled it near me last night, it belonged to the chairs of the assembly hall in town, not to my bottle for headaches." "Did you see the parlour dome moved?" "I saw Althea set it straight, and Mrs. Marden almost reach and then not. I saw Mr. Vale tap a dome because he has a boy's need to be heard by the things he owns. Did you see Noel Gable near the suites?" Mira hesitated. He passed the door with a rag on his shoulder, as if it were a medal. There was orange in his wake, and when he looked at the frames, he looked at himself in them. That is a man who loves polish more than reflection. Felix Daw returned at noon with a small parcel of conclusion. The residue on the twist is spirit varnish with orange oil. The smear on the glass shows traces of the same, and a whisper of ether. I think someone meant only to sicken and frighten, not to destroy. A stronger drench would have turned the blood blue and the lips with it. This was a tester's hand. Why test on Mrs. Vale? Calder asked. If the hand's grievance is with London polish and memory erased, why not Mr. Vale? Hercule walked the circumference of that question and came back wearing it. Because Mr. Vale would shout and flail and gather pity damp as a towel. Mrs. Vale crumples in silence and gathers whispers. If your aim is to breed whisperers, this is a good way. Lord save us from cleverness, Sabine Hart muttered. A constable returned before one with Noel Gable in tow, a young man with cheerful boots and a handsome head. He carried as if it had earned more rooms than it had yet entered. He took off his cap at once before Mrs. Marden and smiled at her with a warmth that would have sold anything that was not nailed down. "Sir," said Calder with a civil nod. "You polished frames yesterday?" "Yes, Inspector." "Your worship." "My lord." Noel bowed to each possibility. "Mrs. Marden wrote a note to my father, and I came with my little kit. The ballroom frames will be ready for London in a week if the rest of the house could follow them." "What is in your little kit?" Calder asked. "Orange oil polish of the trade," Noel said, still smiling. "A touch of shellac spirit for the wounds and cracks. A rag for each, and a rag for the dust the rags make." He produced the tin and the bundle with the innocence of a boy showing shells. The tin, when opened, made the air bright and a little sharp. Orange, yes, and the breath of spirits. The rags were carefully tied with twine. One bore a sugar hardening along a crease, glittering as if it had been dipped and set. "Where did your rag kiss sugar?" Calder asked too gently. Noel blinked, then frowned at the rag as if it had misbehaved in his absence. "Huh, that's odd. Must have brushed a plate when I passed the parlour. I am careful. Mrs. Marden will tell you I don't touch where I shouldn't." "Mrs. Marden?" Calder asked without looking away from Noel. Violet Marden had watched the young man closely, hunger and distaste fighting under her composed mouth. "He's careful," she said at last, "and vain. He knows what varnish will do to silk and to lace, and he avoids it. I put him to the frames to keep him out of the carpets, and he stayed out." "Did you serve sweets last night?" Hercule asked her. Violet's hands tightened around each other. I stood near the parlor door to watch the traffic. The house has guested kings and factories. I will not have guests who take with both hands. I did not serve sweets because Mrs. Cray runs her fetes as if they were crusades, and to interrupt is to die on the steps. Did you step in to correct a dome? Hercule said mildly. She looked at him long and then away. I was going to. Someone else did it first. I do not abide crooked. Which someone else? Calder asked. The schoolmistress, Violet murmured. She has never met a line she did not marry. Noel Gable's charm had dimmed by degrees under the inspector's patience. Now he tried one more beam. Sir, if you say someone used my polish for mischief, I say that's not how my trade works. We put shine where there's dull, not ill where there's well. The world is obliged to folk who stick to their guild, Calder said. But the world also holds folk who borrow a guild to do a thing in shadow. We will keep your tin. You may go as far as the hall and no farther. Noel glanced toward Violet as if to be rescued, and found that she had discovered the use of silence. He went obediently to the hall and took a seat on a bench, boots aligned as if for inspection. He began to whistle under his breath a tune so mild it could not offend any listening door. Not him, Sabine Hart said low, watching his profile. Her boy who varnishes frames may love polish too much to be safe with his own face, but his hands wouldn't do this through a woman already aching. He'd choose a brag, not a whisper. Unless he was led, Hercule murmured. Led by a hand that is neat, that loves straightening, that can write lists twice and make the second look like the first. Calder's mouth twitched. You like the schoolmistress for this, do you? I like that her mind leaves a wedge no circle likes, said Hercule. But I am a friend of evidence, not of liking. I will not embrace until the facts ask me. They took the afternoon to shake the tree of facts some more. Crispin Oates purred about stewardship and the infirmary roof until Calder asked if the vestryman had ever wrapped a glass in a handkerchief soaked in turpentine to lift wax from a font, at which point he coughed and declared everything to be Mrs. Cray's department. Mrs. Cray declared that besides mercy and tea she administered only biscuits and tongs and would thank the inspector to keep his insinuations. "And his own pocket, Major." Stone presented his hands with a sailor's frankness. "Rosine for the bow," he said when Hercule sniffed faintly. "The quartet ran short last night. I carry a cake and I spare when asked." He shrugged his large shoulders. "We use rosin. The lady uses oil. You'll get both scents if you stand between us." "Did you pass through the parlor?" Calder asked. "Twice. Once to fetch a case mirrors and once to tell Bram to fetch his wife because the soup's skin was thickening. I touched nothing. My trade at sea cured me of poking domes." "Your boots," Hercule said, because he had glanced at them and seen an old habit worn into the leather. "You walk on the outer edges." "Bad knee," Stone grunted. "She makes me walk like a woman in an old painting. Why?" Hercule only smiled an apology and looked elsewhere. By 4 o'clock the winter light had thinned to the color of breath on glass. Seraphine Vale woke enough to say water and please, and once no with the strength of a child refusing milk. Sabine Hart sent everyone out for 10 minutes, and then for another 10 just to have a silence in which a patient might decide not to die. In the hall, Hercule stood beside the small table that held the dome he had studied the night before. It sat now exactly centered, its wet circle complete, its reflection sharp. A cluster of villagers had grown around Noel Gable. He was telling a funny story about a church door that stuck only when bishops arrived. People laughed because it was permitted relief. Althea Rowan came from the gallery carrying the hymn board of all things, because there was no safer thing to carry. She paused by the parlor table, looked at the dome's placement, adjusted it, and took 3 paces. Then she stopped, came back and adjusted again, making a circle even more complete than the first. Hercule did not move, but in his mind he placed a tick mark next to a line he had written that morning, and then rewritten, like a schoolmistress correcting herself. He let the sound of Noel's story spill over the scene so that no one would hear his pencil on paper. Mrs. Cray arrived with a basket of things that had no use except to make the hands feel useful. Violet Marden came from the back stairs wearing a shawl she had not worn all winter. A heavy old piece, with a border of small leaves executed in a lace long out of honest fashion. She saw Hercule see her, and looked down and then up and then past him. And he read in that movement a fact that stepped daintily out of the shadow. The lace under the glass last night had not been one of the fete cloths. It had been something older, something she would not sacrifice to orange oil unless she had not chosen. She had brought it herself in a moment of vanity or memory, and someone had stained it for her pains. "Madame," he said as she passed, softly enough that only she would hear. "I regret your cloth," her mouth trembled. "He told me to dress the place for the city," she whispered, the anger naked now. "He said my house was a museum of losses, and if we must have losses, we might as well have them polished." Her eyes shone. "So I put out one fine piece just to say that there had been fineness here once without London telling us how." She swallowed. "It was stained before the bell for grace had finished ringing." "You moved the cloth," he said. "I did not," she returned at once. "I wanted to after, but the inspector was there, and I thought if I moved one thing they would say I moved all." "Wise," Hercule said, "and very hard." It was nearly dark when Inspector Calder said, "We will close the rooms that have more memory than use. We will ask Mrs. Vale for her story when Dr. Hart grants it. We will not accuse. We will watch." "While we watch," said Hercule, "the person who tested their hand will decide whether to improve their work or abandon it. They will do one or the other that suits their temperament." "Neat people pick up," Calder said, "and people who straighten lines," Hercule finished with him. They stepped out into the early evening, the sky a brittle blue cut by chimney smoke. A brittle peace hung with it, the sort that cracks if spoken to. The lamplighter went down the lane with his pole and made small domestic stars. At the inn, Bram Yarrow was ladling stew for men who had pretended all day to be less interested than they were. Hercule took a bowl and a slice of bread and a place near the hearth. Mira came in later with her case. She was careful of it as of a living thing. She sat on the settle opposite and warmed her hands, and did not look at him, and then did. "I am not offended that you watched my bottles," she said softly. "I would watch them too if I were you. It is my life's profession to watch where people put their hands, and to hear where they put their words," she returned. "We do the same in our ways. I listen for what a hall gives back. Hard corners, soft curtains, reluctances. A bad room lies to you, and then you play out a tune. What does the Grange give back?" he asked, pride and weariness. "And someone walking through it at night who does not like to be unseen. Who?" She lifted a shoulder. "Boots that do not squeak because they are kept too well. A person who stops to straighten flowers in a vase when no one is there to see. I heard it while I tuned. It is not a crime to care for symmetry. It is sometimes a sign of what? Of a mind that will not forgive the world for its ragged edges." Her mouth softened in a rueful smile. "We make art to tolerate ragged edges. Others make rules." He thought of Althea's hymn board aligned with a mathematical sweetness, and of the dome she could not leave alone. He thought of a lace cloth pulled from a drawer because a woman wanted one thing of hers to shine in a house that had been let. He thought of Noel Gable's rags, the sugar glitter hardened into one crease like gilt that had sprouted crystals. "Inspector," he said later, when Calder joined him with his own stew, "we will ask Mrs. Vale 2 questions when Sabine says now. We will ask whether the sweetness was bitter, and we will ask whether anyone had lately taught her to write a letter in a nicer hand than her own." Calder paused, spoon mid-air. "You suspect a hand that teaches?" "A hand that corrects," said Hercule. "One that watches others' letters and their margins and thinks, I could make this neater, and they would thank me for it if they knew. For such a hand it would be easy to take a twist of peel, dress it with a finishing touch and think, it is almost nothing, it is only a test, and it is tidy to test. For such a hand it is nothing to straighten domes and cloths while you are at it, so that the scene looks as a scene should. God keep us from tidy malice," Calder muttered. Then he sighed. "And if you are wrong, then the varnish will tell us another story," Hercule said. "It always does. Varnish preserves. It remembers what the wood cannot." The door opened to a skitter of snow, and Major Stone came stamping in. He held up a folded slip of paper with rough triumph. "Telegram. From Cretan. Gable Sr. says the boy left him short a tin of spirit polish last week. Signed it out for extra work and brought it back half a measure light." Stone thumped the bar with his fist. Frame polishing doesn't drink polish like that. Calder took the slip and read it again. He looked up at Hercule. Perhaps the boy did a brag first and a whisper after. Or someone borrowed his brag, Hercule said, not yet done with his own suspicion. We will see whether the polish's kiss on the sugar matches Gable's tin. Daw can tell us that, yes? He can, Calder said. And will. The night deepened. The inn stacked quiet around the hearth. In the half-hour before the hour when fear is most articulate, a single bell sounded from the grange. It was not the kitchen bell nor the front. It was a small handbell used by housemaids when a bedroom requires something now, not after. Graham Yarrow had used one as a boy. Calder was on his feet before the sound had died. Hercule was already at the door, coat unbuttoned, scarf around his throat like a sentence begun but not finished. They went out into the brittle dark at a run. They met Sabine Hart at the top of the stairs, breath high, eyes steady. "She's awake," the doctor said. "She remembers." And she said a sentence before she remembered not to. Sabine's mouth tightened. It will not be a good sentence for someone. They went into the quiet room. Seraphine Vale sat propped in pillows, a shawl around her dark hair. Colour had returned to her mouth in a thin defiance. Her eyes, when they found Calder, were full of anger that had been waiting too long for a respectable excuse. "I do not like to be made a spectacle," she said first, because that was the shallowest anger, and therefore the safest. Then she looked past the inspector, and met Hercule's small green gaze and did not waste his time. "It was bitter," she said. "The sugar was bitter where it should not have been. And," she swallowed, "I have been taking instruction in a better hand." "From whom, madame?" Hercule asked gently. Seraphine's eyes flicked toward the door and then to the small table with the dome, and then toward the bookshelf where a child's copybook sat, forgotten from a summer long gone. She closed her eyes and opened them again. "From Miss Rowan," she said very quietly, "because she said if I wrote as if I had been born here, they would not hate me for what my husband has done." In the hush that followed, downstairs a chair creaked, and in the parlour, a glass dome moved a short whisper on the wood, and then exactly back where it had been. Inspector Calder did not sleep. He sent Daw back to his bench with Gable's tin and rags. He sent a constable to fetch copies of Miss Rowan's school timetables. He sent another to tramp the Grange perimeters with a lantern, slow as a clock hand, to see what the frost would confess. The frost did confess. Before dawn, the constable came stiff-fingered to the inn, cap in hand. "Under the parlour window, sir. 2 prints neat as sums. Not a man's broad last, narrow. Worn to the inside at the heel. Came up to the sill and back again." He mimed the way a careful foot turns in ever so slightly with each step. Hercules' small green eyes warmed, as if someone had spelled a word correctly at last. Mercy. At 8, Sabine Hart allowed 2 questions only. Seraphine Vale, a little colour now, a little steadiness, answered both. Yes, the sweetness had been bitter. At one corner, as though the sugar had been dressed, she said with a small curl of disgust. And yes, she had recently altered the way she signed her name. "Miss Rowan persuaded me to lose the great loop on my S, because it looked," she said, "too London for a village card. She made my hand small. She said it would save me." "Save you from what?" Hercule asked. "From being disliked for things I had not done," Seraphine said, and looked away. "She said if I wrote like a neighbour, they would forgive my husband for letting the Grange out." Outside, Daw had results. "The residue on the twist," he said, "matches Gable's polish close enough to be brothers. Orange oil on top, shellac spirit beneath. A whisper of ether that does not belong to frames but to haste. Mine own hands, if I had done it, would not have left the ether. I am careful because illness does not forgive." "Who is not careful?" Calder asked. "Someone who loves straight lines more than chemistry," Daw said dryly, surprising them. "Someone who would call a half-measure tidy enough." By noon, as if to prove that malice rarely pauses, once it has tasted its own cunning, a second incident bloomed. Major Stone, after delivering a hamper to Violet Marden, so the man of the house would be seen doing, took a nip from his flask in the lane and cursed so roundly he apologized to the church wall. "Bitter," he rasped, spitting into the snow. Burned the tongue. "Not my lot. He wiped the mouth of the flask on his sleeve and brought it to Dor as if he'd just netted a shark. Same family, Dor announced after a moment. Not enough to drop an ox, but enough to remind one's throat who is in charge. Someone is testing edges, not delivering ends. Who had the flask before you? Calder asked. No one. Stone narrowed his eyes. Unless someone loves me more than I deserve and kissed it while I was looking the other way. I left it in the cloakroom last night. Mrs. Cray herded us like hens. Anyone could have kissed it then. Hercule did not look at Althea Rowan across the square when he heard this. He looked at her hymn board instead. It stood propped in the vestry. The glass over its little tin numerals had been wiped so clean it rebuked fingerprints by merely existing. Orange, he murmured, catching the faintest ghost when the sun slid. Across the pane Althea found him. There because it is the nature of tidy minds to check the place that they last perfected. You moved the dome twice. Yesterday, he said without preamble. It was crooked twice, she returned, a little nettle under her calm. I teach children that crookedness is a petition for help. One answers. You straightened Seraphine's hand. You offered to save her. She asked to belong, Althea said, and her voice softened unexpectedly. I do not hate the woman, monsieur. I hate being told by Mr. Vale that belonging is for sale if one can price it. He has made Violet Marden poor by sums. He cannot make her small by taste while I live. And so you test? You dress a sugar corner with a finish and let gossip do the chassis work? Her chin lifted. If I wished her dead, she would be dead, she said quietly. I wished not to kill, but to correct. Men like Mr. Vale understand nothing except consequence. Let him see that his polish has a taste. Major Stone is not Mr. Vale. Major Stone has made a trade of his voice and his certainty, she said. He pronounces. I pronounced back. Hercule heard in that a mind that has excused itself with a sentence, and now carries it around like a permit. He stepped aside to let her pass and made a note in his pocket. Not murder in the heart. Order. Danger. Thinks measure is mercy. Noel Gable, meanwhile, tried to wash the scent of suspicion from his hands by presenting them for inspection wherever he went. I'm a polisher, not a poisoner, he told anyone who would listen. If something shines, I applaud. That's my crime. Your rag-kissed sugar, Hercule said to him late that afternoon, when Bram Yarrow had let them borrow the back room because Mrs. Yarrow would not have a scene among the teapots. Hercule placed Noel's rag, now hardened along one crease beside the twist from Seraphine's bedside, now sealed under glass. I brushed a plate, Noel said, contrite and artless. Inspector, I'm a fool. I looked at myself in the glass over the mantel, and not at where my rags went. If you wish to thrash me for vanity, I deserve it. Who spoke to you while you worked? Calder asked. Mrs. Marden once, keep away from the silk boy, and the schoolmistress twice, first to tell me that the frames were 18th century French, which I pretended I knew, and then to ask me whether I'd ever seen a certain sort of varnish used on hymn boards. She said she'd read about it in a book. Did you show her your tin? Hercule said. Noel looked ashamed. She is a teacher, sir. If a teacher asks to see what's in your box, you show it. Evening again. The thaw drew back into itself and the world sharpened. In the Grange's quiet room, Seraphine Vale sat propped like a figure in a painting one would rather not have to finish. Sabine Hart had permitted one more visitor only. Violet Marden. Your lace, Seraphine said before Violet could speak. I have stained it twice over, once with a husband and again with a sugar. The ghost of a smile. Miss Rowan would prefer my lines smaller. I am not very good at small things. We kept the house by large things once, Violet said. Bread, blankets, weddings, funerals. Mr. Vale keeps it now by small things, prices, polish, pamphlets. He told me the frames would fetch respect in London if we oiled them. I told him the house would fetch respect if he left it alone. He did not understand. Would you understand if I left him? Seraphine asked, half to the window. He loves admiration so much he thinks it is a prayer. Violet's mouth softened. Leave or stay, I can feed you. That I understand. She reached and set the shawl on Seraphine's shoulders, a different shawl this time, plain, warm. I do not forgive cruelty dressed as order, she said almost to herself. But I can forgive foolishness that tries to be kind and does not come off. When Violet had gone, Calder came in with Hercule. Sabine lingered, arms folded, physician and parishioner both. They set no trap. They did not need to. They did something far more dangerous for the guilty. They let conversation happen where silence had been kept. "We have prints," Calder said, "under the parlor window, narrow, turned in. We have polish borrowed from a boy because teachers are trusted. We have a hymn board wiped until it scolds. We have a lace cloth someone dared not move after the stain because she had already moved it too many times in her life, for smaller men to put back again. And we have a list," Hercule added. He took from his pocket a sheet Dor had brought from Miss Rowan's schoolroom, 12 names of children, bringing apples and tin soldiers to the tableau, and laid it beside a calling card Seraphine had addressed in the new, small hand Miss Rowan had taught her. The curves were identical. The terminals turned with the same modest humility. One wrote both, Hercule said gently. Or one stood over the other's hand and pressed lightly at the knuckles to teach it how to end itself without flourish. The door moved behind them with the small whisper of a person who will not eavesdrop and cannot prevent herself. Althea Rowan stepped in with her composure ironed and her mouth set at O. "If you intend to accuse me in a bedchamber," she said, "at least have the grace to speak as if to a woman and not a suspect." "It is not accusation," Hercule said. "It is geometry. We have a circle, the fet, and we have a wedge your hand that corrected it. That wedge appears everywhere. On the dome, on the hymn board, on the list and the card. On the polished tin whose lid is set always exactly so many degrees from its mark. It appears under the parlor window, because your right heel wears inward a little where your pupils' desks have made you turn after each row since Michaelmas." Althea's eyes flared, not in guilt but in the indignity of being seen. "Do you bring a village to heel by looking at its shoes?" "I bring a mind to heel by looking where it leaves itself," Hercule said mildly. "Madam, you have the worst possible motive, a good one. You wish to correct, to restore proportion. You do not love Mr. Vale's London. You do not love Violet bending to it. You do not love Sergeant Stone's pronouncements. You do not love Seraphine's unreadable city hand in a village, where everybody knows everybody's letters. So you thought to teach a lesson that would sting and not scar." "I meant to frighten," Althea said, straight as a yardstick now, as if a lesson had begun. "The boy's polish did what I required. A bitter taste, a trembling, a story that would take root in the lane. I wiped the hymn board because greasy fingerprints are an insult to prayer. I straightened the dome because crookedness is an appeal I cannot refuse. I showed Mrs. Vale how to sign her name, as if she were not leaning on our poor backs while her husband sells our house to people who use it like a stage. If you tell me this is murder," her voice faltered, and then did the most human thing it had done since the case began. It softened. "Then I will go where murderers go. But know that I left Holt's where I could have ended. Know that I tested men with voices and not women with babies. Know that I was—" She searched for a word that would save her and found none. "Tidy," she finished bitterly, "and thought tidiness would not spill blood." Sabine Hart's voice came low and steady. "Tidy poisons kill as readily as messy ones. You did not know where Seraphine's heart would stop, because no one ever does. A lesson with varnish is still a lesson with poison. You left lives to gamble with your idea of proportion." Althea's hands unclasped and fluttered once, helplessly like papers in an open window. For one instant, she looked not like a schoolmistress or a judge of domes, but like a woman who lives alone with her correction, and has for years. Then she gathered herself and did what tidy souls do when faced with disgrace. She told it herself in order. "I wrote a note to Mrs. Vale 3 days before the fete," she said. "In her new hand, with mine guiding it, I made it seem hers to herself, if that makes sense to anyone but me. When the noise becomes too much, take a cup to the small parlor and rest. You need not ask. I thought I told myself that I was showing her a kindness. That was the lie I told first. On the night, I borrowed the tin from Noel because he worships instruction and I am a teacher. I dressed a corner of sugar. I chose the quiet room because the stain would be small and the scene would not frighten children. I saw Mrs. Marden set her lace for pride and thought, Better to show the stain on pride than on flesh. That was lie the second. When Major Stone blustered, I touched the mouth of his flask with my rag one swipe, and told myself he of all men would survive a little bitterness in his mouth. I straightened the dome because it begged me. If you will put irons on me now, Inspector, do it quickly and without spectacle. Calder had said very little in the last minutes. Now he spoke, not as a man with handcuffs, but as one with a parish of his own to keep from breaking. Miss Rowan, the law calls any deliberate dosing a crime, no matter how you style it. You will answer to that. It will hear you say, I did not mean death, and it will answer as the doctor did, you cannot ever be sure. There will be mercy because of measure. There will be judgment because of intent. Althea inclined her head. She had known her own sentence since the moment she chose the word frighten and not teach. Before Calder could lift his hand, Seraphine Vale spoke. A small thing, but clear. You made me small, she said, not with malice, but with the clean precision of an ink line. You taught me to fold my letters into a village shape, and you fed me bitterness to prove your arithmetic. I will live because a doctor happened to be 3 doors away, and a poisoner happened to be neat. Do not ever say I meant only to a woman whose heart you have stopped. Althea's eyes filled then, and one tear escaped, because even rulers bend when something is true enough. Calder took her hand with the odd courtesy he reserved for arrests that did not require wrestling. Miss Rowan, he said, you will come with me. We'll go the back way. Mrs. Marden, if you're near, I'll ask you to keep the front. I don't want this to be a show. Violet Marden materialized from the corridor like a good house does when asked. She had a key in her fingers and a jaw that would stand between her people and a staring crowd until dusk fell. As Calder led Althea out, Hercule gathered the papers, the list, the card, and set them gently on the table by Seraphine's hand. Madame, he said, you will not make your hand smaller again for anyone. If they do not forgive, let them be untidy. Seraphine's mouth quirked. I will make it mine, she said. Which may be worse. Alderwick held its breath because villages do not have the language for this kind of crime. They know theft and heat of blood, thump and shout and shame and Sunday. They do not know a punishment mixed under a glass dome and delivered with the manners of a school. Inspector Calder's report was simple, because simple reports are hardest to break. He attached Dawes' analysis. He attached the constable's sketch of the inward worn print. He attached the telegram from Gable Sr. He attached Sabine Hart's first notes. He did not attach any of the Lane's furies. Accessory? Violet asked him, stony in her doorway, when the first rush had passed and the second, the ugly one, prepared to start. You'll be charging me? For what? Calder said, honestly puzzled. For letting young men polish frames. For letting domes be crooked until they weren't. For bringing lace out of a drawer to please a man I do not like, because I wanted one thing that had been mine to shine. Calder shook his head. You will be charged with bringing broth and lending shawls, and not letting gawkers past your hall. Those are the crimes of women in stupid years. The rest is on the one who poured. Violet's chin eased. Then I will go on keeping the front door shut, and the kitchen door open. There is nothing else to do. Noel Gable came, hat in hand, to apologize for being too ready to please authority with his tin. Sabine Hart told him to bring his hands and his trade to the infirmary roof when spring thawed the tar. If you wish to varnish something, she said, varnish the chairs where old men sit with bad legs. I'll find you rags that never kissed sugar. Major Stone sent his flask to the back of a drawer and took to carrying lemon drops. Safer for a mouth that runs too hot, he said, with a grudging good humor that had learned something. He would always proclaim, but perhaps with a smaller. Trumpet Lysander Vale wrote a letter to his London circle, describing a most extraordinary provincial drama in which a pedagogue of formidable rectitude perpetrated a miniature reign of terror. He did not post it, because Seraphine read it first and tore it across the lessened S with a neatness that looked like Miss Rowan's, and was not. You can stay, she told him then, if you learn the meanings of ours and yours. If you cannot, London can have you back polished to your taste. I will not be polished. He stared at her, truly seeing her for perhaps the first time. Lysander was not wicked. He was thirsty, and admiration had been the only water he had ever understood. He looked at Violet Marden standing behind his wife with a shawl and a saucepan and a refusal to move. He looked at Hercule, who was tying a string around a parcel, as if it were not his business whether a marriage stood or fell. "Teach me," he said, unwilling in a man's way. And Seraphine did not smile, and so there was hope. Mira Kovacs played at Sunday service because music treads where words cannot. She did not play something clever. She played a hymn very straight, and then at the end a single bar of ornament, quiet a mercy proof that order and kindness do not have to quarrel. Althea Rowan went away without spectacle. She did not beg. She did not argue. She did not allow anyone to weep over her coat. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived at the school tied with twine and franked by a magistrate, arrangements for an interim teacher, an inventory of chalk, a request for the hymn-board key. The hymn-board glass, curiously, fogged less now. No one wiped it until it squeaked. Hercule walked the lane with Inspector Calder on the last afternoon, before the roads opened and his train would leave. They paused by the parlour window under which the prince had been, and looked at the place where breath had once made little clouds in the air, while someone balanced on the sill, decisive and small. "You were certain early," Calder said. "I was prepared early," Hercule corrected. "Certainty is a tyrant. Preparation is a friend." The varnish spoke first, the dome second, the lace third, the hand last. The motive was the most dangerous kind, because it sounded like virtue. When someone tells you they will make you better by force, lock the cupboard and count the spoons. Calder laughed under his breath. "You'll leave me with that, will you? Counting spoons and watching hymn-boards for orange ghosts." "I'll leave you with Dornhart and Mrs. Marden," Hercule said, "and with a house that decided after much foolishness to remember its own weight." They reached the inn. Dram Yarrow had put the kettle on because he had eyes. Mrs. Yarrow had baked something she pretended was left over, but was not. Mira's case leaned against a chair. She would walk Hercule to the station and ask him questions about halls in Paris he would answer badly, because he would describe people instead. "Will you write this up?" Calder asked at the door, half teasing, half in hope of a page he might keep in a drawer for days, when order looked like a virtue again. Hercule considered, and then shook his head. "If I write it, someone will say the lesson is, beware the schoolmistress. That is wrong. The lesson is, beware the person who cannot abide a crooked dome. It is rarely the dome they wish to straighten." Calder offered his hand. "You're a good man to have in a winter." "I am a small man who insists people do not arrange each other without consent," Hercule said. "In spring the village would have saved itself. In winter things crack. It was my privilege to hold a line with you." The train took him away under a sky the colour of tin, past hedges laced with the last bright ice. He opened his notebook and wrote 3 lines. The spirit carried the bitter shellac. The orange oil masked it. The sugar ferried it to the tongue. Neatness weaponized is a kind of cowardice. Houses remember. Let them. He closed the book and looked out at fields that would be green. In the window he saw his own reflection, and behind it for a moment, the faintest suggestion of a glass dome perfectly centered, waiting for a hand to nudge it off by a hair on purpose, so that the room could breathe. Back in Alderwick, Violet Marden set a fresh cloth on the parlour table, not lace, linen, stout and clean. She placed the dome a trifle to the left and left it so. She smiled to herself as if she had committed a small crime, and forgiven it in the same gesture. The house, which had listened to lessons from both sides all its life, approved, and in the schoolroom on the first day of the new term, the interim teacher wrote the children's names large on the slate, loops and all, and did not scold a single flourish. The village, which is quicker to heal than it knows, took a breath and let the straight edge wobble where it wanted, just a little, and found that nothing fell. Hercule had said once, quietly to no one in particular, when asked why he disliked the phrase locked room, that the world holds very few locked rooms and many hearts that refuse light. In Alderwick that winter, more than one latch clicked open. The snow melted. The varnish smell faded. The lace stayed in its drawer until Easter, and the dome, wonderfully crooked, caught the sun.